صباح الخير يا إخوتي وأخواتي. سأقدم الورقة بالإنجليزية للأسف، مش لأن الإنجليزي هي لغتي المفضلة، وإنما لأنه تفكيري بعد 50 سنة في المهجر بيطلع أوتوماتيكيا بالإنجليزي بالأول، ده ترجمة العربي بتصير مشكلة. I was tasked this morning with Rima to talk about the value system and the impact of Israel on the value system of Palestinians. Now, writing about value system is a tricky business because it's like mercury, it goes ups and down, and one has to be very careful in contextualizing what the values are, whether they are changing or whether they are stable. Now, public opinion polls and statements by Israeli leaders show that disregard for Palestinian life has characterized the attitudes of Israeli authorities and the Jewish public at large towards its Arab citizens and those who live in the West Bank and Gaza. For Israel, the Palestinians constitute what the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben calls homo sacer, according to which the laws of humanity do not apply to them. Homo sacer is defined in legal terms, in Roman legal terms, as someone who can be killed without the killer being regarded as a murderer, a person who cannot even be sacrificed. The Palestinians exist in conditions of bare life. Their minimal existence is tolerated, but not enhanced. Invariably, the law is suspended when it comes to rectifying Palestinian grievances. Israel is usually quick to cite national security as justification for its lethal actions. Life for Palestinian citizens of the state, as well as those who live in the territories, is in perpetual state of emergency, where the exception to the universal application of the law is the rule. As a colonial state, life in Israel is best viewed from a racialized prism, where ethnicity and race govern the treatment of those it controls. As in all colonial regimes, violence, territory, and population are the three central elements which occupy the colonizer, and Israel is no exception. We have many examples to testify to Israel's subhuman treatment of the Palestinians. For example, Dov Weisglass, who had been Israel's point man in advising successive Israeli prime ministers on policy towards the Palestinians, described at one point the choking off of the food supply and other essential goods to Gaza population during the 2014 invasion of Gaza as akin to a diet regime. He quipped cynically, "It is like an appointment with a dietitian. The Palestinian will get a lot thinner, but will not die." And similar statements were uttered almost by every Israeli leader, from Raphael Eitan, Begin, Barak, even some academics got into the act. Thus, at best, the Palestinians in Israel are treated as a suspect community and as a surplus population in the occupied territories that have to be closely watched and surveilled by the state's various institutions and the Jewish public. The Zionist project remains in full throttle and in line with the dream of the founders of the state. Current and future leadership will not rest until the Palestinian presence in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza is significantly reduced. According to the Trump administration, the most recent enabler of illegal Israeli international conduct in Palestine and elsewhere has broken every conceivable modicum of statesmanship. Not only that Donald Trump has unilaterally moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, cut off the funding of the UNRWA, a UN agency that was created in 1948 to cater to Palestinian refugees, closed down the PLO office in Washington, D.C., sanctioned the misappropriation of the Golan Heights by Israel, who rewarded him by promising to establish a village on the Golan Heights carrying his name. And Pompeo, Trump's Secretary of State, went on record earlier this month condoning Israel's illegal seizure of Palestinian lands on the West Bank for the purpose of building Zionist settlements. Furthermore, it's clear from the Israeli Basic Law that once the land is defined as Jewish, it shall remain so in perpetuity, and its ownership cannot be transferred to any groups or individual. This stance has been codified recently in legislation by the new nationality law, which was referred to throughout this conference. But let me recap here. The main components of the law include the following. First, downgrading the status of the Arabic language. Second, pointing out that Israel is the state of the Jewish people, thus ignoring the fact that demographically there are as many non-Jews, if not more, as Jews living in historical Palestine under Israeli control. Third, that national self-determination is the prerogative of the Jews only. What flows from this, in the absence of defined borders, the law leaves open the possibility that future state borders could extend beyond the current state. I have chosen three areas to examine from the point of view of values. One, public opinion. Secondly, the educational system. And thirdly, an area which is not dealt with by social scientists, and that is the impact of cyber technology in Israel itself, as well as in the occupied areas, primarily in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, the snapshot of public opinion shows that 80% of the Arab respondents endorsed the proposition that as a state, Israel had the right to exist where Arabs and Jews live together. But only 13.8% of Arabs endorsed the proposition that Israel has a right to exist as a solely Jewish state. 72% of the Arabs sample agreed that Israel as a Zionist state in which Arab and Jews live is a racist state, whereas 96.5% of the Jewish sample agreed that Israel was justified in its desire to keep a Jewish majority, and only 24% of the Arabs agreed with this. Furthermore, the Guardian newspaper in 2012 summarized public opinion data to show that more than two-thirds of Israeli Jews endorsed the proposition that should Israel annex the occupied territories, the Arab population should be denied voting rights. For all intents and purposes, this is at the heart of the apartheid proposition. It's also worth pointing out that one-third believed that Arab citizens of the state should be denied voting rights. 58% polled believed that Israel already practices apartheid. 3/4 of those sampled approved of segregated roads, and 50% said that Jews should be treated better than Arabs. This is referring to the Jewish sample. Now, for the education, looking at the values of the education, invariably, educational values transmitted in school textbooks, and here I'm referring to a study done not long ago at the Hebrew University, shows that racism, illegitimacy of Palestinians, denial of Palestinians' right to claim the land and live in the land as equal citizens are on the top of the list with regard to education. And a form of Jewish elite racism, I'm quoting here, is apparent in the discourse of maps. Here, maps are drawn to exclude the legitimacy of Palestinian presence on the West Bank and Gaza. And maps are a very important tool of propaganda. Finally, social media is being used extensively by Israel for the purpose of monitoring and surveilling the Arab population. Facebook is used for analysis by Israeli in order to draw up profiles of Palestinians and go after Palestinians and arrest them. So hundreds of Palestinians have been arrested. Pages in Facebook were removed because from the point of view of the Israelis, that the Palestinians constitute a security threat with regard to Israel. So cyber technology and the use of computer algorithms have been extensively used by Israel to profile Palestinians, arrest Palestinians on the basis of profile, keeping in mind that profiling minorities is something that has been heavily criticized in social science, the US included. So in other words, the situation of the Palestinians is sort of, I would say, mass surveillance. Mass surveillance on the ground, on the air, and also now electronically. Not to mention the fact that surveillance of Palestinians is really one-way process. When they launch complaints against the government with regard to surveillance that the Israeli right-wing practices, and there were hundreds and thousands of those examples collected by Palestinian monitors, then there is no reaction, hardly any, to speak of. Finally, I want to just spend a couple of minutes to talk about one area that has also received no mention. That is, we are undergoing now, geopolitically, very important changes in the Middle East. Changes that really preceded the Middle East as such, changes from liberalism to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism signifies what? It signifies the adoption of minimum regulation, privatization, and choking off the mobility, the attitudes of Palestinians. Now, this has ramification for Israeli in the West Bank and Gaza. It really has ramifications for the Palestinians. Israel has privatized its security industry, so-called security industry, very heavily on the West Bank and Gaza, brought in private security firms to monitor the Palestinians, man the checkpoints, man sort of the roads, and uses very sophisticated technology through face recognition and other methods in order to trap and capture the Palestinians and eventually process them and put them in jail. So in other words, cyber technology, neoliberalism, privatization These are forces that have worked jointly together in order to sort of disenfranchise the Palestinians further. Thank you very much.